All right, now I'd like to move on to a discussion of one of my favorite German painters, Caspar David Friedrich, who is an exact contemporary of both Goethe and William Blake. Goethe's dates, recall, were 1749 to 1832. Friedrich's dates are 1774 to 1840. He died at the age of 65. So what I would like to do is take a look at his complete oeuvre in terms of three distinct phases that I think we can demarcate, and they move neatly, I think, in 7-year cycles. Starting when he was 23 years old, that's when he really first starts doing work as an artist. And the first phase I like to think of in terms of the evolution of consciousness from a dreaming consciousness mode to then, in about mid-career, a waking mode, and then back again to the dream world during the last 15 years of his life. So the first cycle moves in terms of 3 7-year subphases, and so it's actually 21 years for the first dreaming phase. And this is one of the paintings from that period here. I just want to do a quick flyby of the 3 macro phases, and then I want to look at the first subphase in detail. This is mist. And so the forms during this first macro phase are in a dreamlike, slumberous state here. This is mist. And then we have his very famous abbey in the oak wood. Very dreamlike, very creepy, gothic figures. Then we have Morning in the Risingaberge here, which is also very dreamlike. And winter snow with church. You can barely make out the human figures cast aside as crutches there at the base of the cross. And then it moves into a middle period of where we begin to see, in terms of sort of a Gene Gibbsian take on this, where Friedrich wakes up to the world and moves out of the dreamlike slumber into a world of bright waking day forms, and the forms are concrete, more or less realistic. His paintings are peopled with people for the first time, really. We start seeing actual people in jovial company with each other, enjoying life, horses out gamboling on the green. This is the middle period, which is the shortest. It's only 7 years, and it coincided with the period of his marriage. And then he moves back, starting from here, from about 1824, 1825, for the last 15 years. He moves back into the slumberous dream world, starting here with the Sea of Ice. This is 1824, but it really kicks in 1825 when the graveyard images start coming back in and the people start vanishing once again from his art. And this is one of the last things he did, this sepia, coffin grave, and owl sepia drawings. He had a stroke in 1835 that rendered his last 5 years, he was incapable of handling oil painting, and so he was only able to do watercolors and sepia drawings. But some of the drawings are his finest work. So what I'd like to do then is to go back to look. So those are the 3 macro phases. It moves from a sort of dreamlike, slumberous consciousness to the waking consciousness. The world opens up to him, bright waking daylight forms, and then back into the dream world. So this is at the beginning. I want to start, this is 1797 when he's 23 years old, and I want to start here with the first subphase, which is only the first 7 years of his painting career, which extends to 1804. So 1797 to 1804. And this is one of his first paintings. This is a watercolor landscape with pavilion. And already I think we can see here that there's a sense of aptitude toward decaying culture forms, toward ruinous, wrecked things which indicate the passage of time, the world of shells and vacancies that life has left behind in its wake. I think there's already a fascination with that in this one of the first watercolors. Here's one of the earliest. This is another watercolor, one of the earliest images of the grave. This is a grave stone, and then next we get. This is an astonishingly self-confident first oil painting. If it is the first, it may not be the actual first, but it's one of the first. It's 1798, Wreck on the Sea of Ice, one of the few works from this first 7-year period that have human beings in them. And so one of the things that we'll see is in these 3 macro cycles, and within the first macro cycle of the dream world, the world of the abyss, there's a differentiation between the first subphase, where they're basically, each one of these phases has a human motif to it, a motif in which, in this case, in the first phase, humans are absent. That's the motif. And then what will happen is it moves into subphases of the first macro cycle. Subphases 2 and 3 have the lone protagonist, the lone wayfarer, the monk by the sea, the woman studying a book alone in the garden. So it moves to the lone protagonist, and then with the second macro cycle, the waking period, the human motif shifts to jovial companions. When his wife enters into his life at the age of 44, you start seeing him depicting human individuals out strolling and sailing and looking at the moonlight in jovial company. And then once we get back down to the third macro cycle, back to the dream world, he starts turning away, and people disappear from his art again, as they were absent here in the beginning, with a few exceptions, and this oil painting is one of them. He turns full circle to absent, depicting a world absent human beings, and he never really was that interested in the human form anyhow. When he does depict people, their backs are turned to us. He was perfectly capable of drawing, because there are plenty of self-portraits and portraits of family members, his father and so forth, that are full emphase visages that are perfectly capable, as good as anything Rembrandt ever did. And I think that this artist is almost as talented as Rembrandt, probably my second favorite artist of all time after Rembrandt, second favorite painter anyway, Leonardo, Rembrandt, and Friedrich. And I intend to do video series on Leonardo and Rembrandt also, possibly also J.M.W. Turner. And so with those 3 macro phases, there's a kind of inhalation-exhalation rhythm. I think the first phase is an inhalation. The middle waking phase is an exhalation out into the world, whereas the third macro phase is an inhalation again, which he ends with. So just the one oil painting from this first 7-year subphase, and the planet Saturn probably in astrology does have something to do with this. I think it correlates very neatly. The Saturn makes transits every 7 years. 7 years it squares itself at a 90-degree angle, then opposes itself at 180 degrees, then squares again 90 degrees, and it's every 7 years, and Saturn has to do with the crossing of thresholds. There's a difficult threshold. If you'll review your life, you'll realize that every 7 years there's some sort of difficult threshold crossing that needs to take place. Not only that, but every 14 years, when Saturn is in opposition to itself, it brings back something in your life that was there 14 years earlier. And I'm not going to go through these astrological details so much in this series, but I did notice that very often 14 years, Friedrich will paint something, 14 years later he'll return to that same painting, topic, or motif and rework it 14 years later. So I did notice this, not only the 7-year Saturn rhythm, but this 14-year aspect, which brings you back. This is one of his earliest images of graves and burials. It looks like these, and one of the rare occurrences of actual people here. This is 1799 in this first subphase, which is largely absent. I've only selected a few drawings and paintings from this first subphase, but most of them are absent. If you look at them, if you look at all of them, human beings are rare occurrences. But this is one of the earliest. The cross is one of his favorite, absolute favorite signifiers, and the graveyard as well. And we already saw the first sort of tombstone. And this is an absolutely beautiful landscape. Again, note absent human beings. View from Arcona of 1803. It's a sepia drawing, absolutely astonishingly good. And then here's another rare example of a human being from this period, which already indicates the motif. When people do appear in his paintings, their heads are turned away from us, or we see them only from the back. People just did not interest him, and indeed he did not get married until he was 44 years old, and I believe that he had no woman in his life. He was a bachelor all the way up to that point. And it surprised his friends and family members when he said he finally found a woman who was 19 years younger than him. She was only 25 years old, Carolina. But it was largely a happy marriage from that point on. And then so here's one of his earliest images from this period also, 1803, of the ruins of a Gothic cathedral. That becomes one of his primary motifs. And indeed, I think that we can see during this first 7-year subphase, pretty much every single motif that later preoccupies his imagination first appears here in Nuke, in seed form already during this period. Pretty much everything. And we have this creepy figure here who looks like he's resting at the side of an open grave. And then also here, the idea that of a signifier, and then in this case the signifier is a Madonna, so a statue of a Madonna at the top of a mountain here, a small mountain. Later this will, as we'll see in the next subphase, this becomes a cross. And then the cross actually will move up from the ground. It will trade out places with this Madonna statue, and then he'll trace a series of mountains with crosses on them until we get the apotheosis of that iconotype with Morning in the Risingaberga, which is a very famous painting. This is 1804, and so we'll see that. And then also, here it is, starting to be elevated. This is a small hillock here with the cross, the signifier of the cross, just being elevated, and then we'll see it gradually rise up. Eventually he's going to put it back up here at the top of mountains that are higher and higher and higher as he moves into this kind of transcendentalist mode of consciousness. Friedrich was a very religious man. He was a Lutheran Christian man, and he was friends with, to a certain degree, with Goethe, although I don't think friend is probably the wrong word to use. They knew each other. Goethe knew his work and admired it reluctantly. He's known to make a couple of comments about liking it and then not liking it, and then liking it again. And then finally, as he's working on his meteorological studies, he asks Friedrich to illustrate his meteorological studies. But, of course, Friedrich is nobody's illustrator. That's a trap artists very often get into, making a few bucks by illustrating, and then you become your ontological status as an artist becomes diminished, and you're reduced to the status of an illustrator. That's not a real artist. So he turned Goethe down. He also knew Heinrich Kleist, whom Goethe did not like. He made a few snarky comments about Kleist's very great play, Penthesilea, about the Amazon woman. Goethe did not like hysterics, and I think he regarded, in Kleist's world, which is another series that I want to do, Kleist's world is prone to hysterics. He pushed things, he was a very tortured young man who pushed things as far as they would possibly go, and his characters are very tortured individuals, and he himself, of course, died in a murder-suicide with his girlfriend. He shot her and then shot himself. At a young age. I forget how old it was. It was not that old, early 30s maybe. But he wrote a play about the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest with Arminius defeating the Romans, that was circulated and may have first been read in Friedrich's studio, with people sitting on chairs sort of secretly reading this, because this was during the period of the Napoleonic campaigns, and Napoleon had subdued Germany at this time, and so the play couldn't be published, let alone performed, since it demonstrates the reaction of the Protestant North against the Catholic South, that goes all the way back to the Germanic barbarians led by Arminius in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, right in the 1st century AD there, early on. And Kleist wrote a play about that called the Battle of Hermann, I believe, and read it. And so Friedrich knew about it, and so he was also well acquainted with Kleist. So he was connected with the highest literary and artistic circles of his time. But this young man is just getting going here, 1797 to 1804. This was done in 1804. These are the first 7 years. And these first 7 years, I think, just right out of the starting gate, he hits the ground running. This is an astonishingly self-assured talent here, looking at these early paintings and drawings. It's quite simply amazing. All right, so we'll leave it there with the introduction to Caspar David Friedrich.